Okay, we're going to take a quick look at grain aeration and storage today. After you put corn in a grain bin, especially coming out of a grain dryer, I have recommendations on how to aerate that grain. We run into a lot of issues. There's a lot of issues with stored grain, and most of those issues come from wrong ideas on how to dry and store grain. So the reason for this presentation is to prevent entrapment, increase grain value in your bin, reduce labor costs, answer questions that I get, and prevent damage to your equipment. So what you're going to see if you follow different grain equipment companies, there's a lot of talk today about grain entrapment. You can get bridged grain, people fall through, get buried in their grain. It's dangerous going in your grain bin. The majority of bridged grain in grain bins is caused by grain that is being stored that is not the proper moisture or not properly aerated, and that is the cause of the grain being out of condition. So basically, grain out of condition causes all sorts of issues like this: bridging, people getting caught in grain. It comes mainly from poorly managed grain. So what is good managed grain? So here we have all of my pictures on this thing come from off the internet. They're nothing, no technical data here. This is not my information. This is university's information. But right here, to store grain, this is from Purdue University. Good clean grain, shelled corn, sold as number 2 grain by spring, 5.5% moisture. It needs to be down to 5.5% moisture so long as you're going to sell it by March in the spring. Now, when I say 5.5% moisture, I'm not saying an average. I'm saying 5.5% moisture is the max moisture. If you're going to store it 6 months or up to 12 months, it needs to be 14%. And when I say 14%, I mean max moisture 14%. Stored more than 1 year, 13%. That means max moisture at 13%. And the reason I'm emphasizing max moisture, we're going to get into that some more here in a minute when we start looking at the reason for the information I want to share. So soybeans sold by spring, 14%. Stored up to 1 year, 12%. Stored more than 1 year, 11%. On up through, we have all our information here. Wheat, oats, barley, up to 6 month, 14. More than 6 month, 13. Sunflowers, up to 6 month, 10. Over 6, 8. And then flaxseed and edible beans. I'm not sure if anybody is into that. There is some of that done, but not much in the regions I work. So this is a guideline. Now, if you put grain that averages 15% out of a grain dryer in your storage bin and you let it set till March and it's not aerated properly, you're going to have rotten corn in your bin. Just a fact of life. You're going to have issues in your grain bin. So fines are sometimes the issue, but usually aeration is basically the issue. So how do you aerate grain? You fill a bin with corn, how do you aerate it? So do you run the fans more than 3 days? What if after 3 days, the air coming out the top is as cold as the air outside? Do you shut the fans off? Why would I recommend to run the fans more than 3 days? For cooling? For equalization. What do I mean equalization? Temperature, moisture, cool, stable corn that stores is what I want at the end of the day. When you are drying corn, like some dryers operate different than others, but the inside of your grain column is going to dry drier than the outside. This grain is going to be drier and hotter than this grain when coming out of the dryer. Your inside grain dries more, your outside dries less. So you are blending wetter and drier grain into the unload auger or the dryer. Whether there's a tower dryer, portable dryer, mixed flow dryer, it does not matter. You might think your mixed flow dries evener. I have proof to show different. So we'll get into that another day. Anyhow, you are not drying all your grain equal in your grain dryer. It mixes it, dumps it into the unload auger, and you get a blend of grain that averages what your test says coming out. As you're filling your bin, you're making layers in your bin. You might have 15% coming out of the dryer for a little, then 14%, then 15.5, and you have layers of grain. It's going to be blended coming out of your dryer, a blend of different moistures, and then you're going to have a blend of different layers in your bin. And then if you fill your bin full, like this, your air is going to take the path of least resistance. It's going to all come up through the floor evenly. It's going to go to the sides easiest. Go to the sides easiest. When you get done cooling, you're going to have damp, warm corn up here. This says cool, wet. I don't agree with that. You're going to have warm, wet corn up here. And no way, it don't matter if you run your fans for a month, you will not blow the humidity or heat out of that peak. It might eventually cool, but there's going to be a big section in here that is warm and damp, and your air is going to go up and out the sides here, path of least resistance. When we look at a grain bin, if we have aeration abilities, on a grain bin, this is a 50,000 bushel grain bin. It has a 53,000 bushel grain bin we're looking at. It's 48-foot bin. It has a 20 horsepower centrifugal fan. We have 0.37 CFM of airflow. This is high airflow, really high airflow for a bin this size for just storage. And if we are to put hot corn in this bin, we get done filling this bin, it takes 37 hours to aerate this bin. And when I call aeration time is a minimum recommendation to push a front through the bin and cool or warm the grain 10 to 15 degrees. So if you want to cool that grain, if it's coming out of a grain dryer hot and you want to cool it 40 degrees, we're going to have to do 3 of these. We're going to have to do 100 hours of the fan operating. That is just for cooling purposes. That is nothing to do with the other reasons that we run the fans after putting corn in the bin. So just cooling alone, this is a paper, like depending how deep your bin is, it says how long it takes to go through. This chart is something that every soak-up dealer can print out for you. If you deal with a soak-up dealer on your grain bins, this chart is something he can print out. He punches in your bin diameter, sidewall height, how many CFMs of airflow he wants. It tells him what for fan to use, or he can enter what fan you have, and he can print out your aeration time. How much roof opening is required, how many square foot of roof opening is required. If you don't have enough roof opening, you're not going to get this aeration. So this is just on one bin. There's a lot of bins with a third the airflow this bin has, and this takes 100 hours to change your grain temp 40 degrees. And after 2 days, you go up to the top and it's going to feel like it's cool, but it's not going to be, the grain is not going to be ambient temperature. So even 100 hours is not as much time as what I am going to tell you you need to have on your grain bin. So when you go to cool your grain, so you don't run into this situation right here, you fill your bin full and then you core it. And when you core it, you pull out of the sender until this sender is the same height as the eave. That way, the air comes through here as easy as it goes through here. You'll have a small bit here, but not enough to be a problem. So when you're coring your bin, this is how to core a bin. People will say if you have a bin, pull 1,000 bushel out or 2,000 bushel out. Unless they know exactly what size bin you're coring, you can't tell someone how many bushel to pull out to core your bin. The way to do it, this sender must be as low as this. The same height or slightly lower. You don't want it V'd down like this or all the air comes through here. If you have it peaked up like this, all the air comes through here. We looked at that right here. So core your bins. When your bin gets full, I don't care whether you go like do individual coring as you load it. That's up to you. I wouldn't recommend that. I don't think there's a benefit to that. But this here must be done once the bin is full. Once your bin is full and you have it cored like this, I want your cooling fan to run for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, your cooling fan must run after the bin is full and it's cored. And you say, well, according to this here, it's only going to take me 100 hours or whatever to get my grain cool. That is correct. But if you remember, we're putting a mixture of moisture into your bin, and it's in layers. I want that grain all the same moisture, all the same temperature, everything dried out. You're going to run your fans for 2 weeks after the bin is full, and then you're going to wait until it's cold out, and you're going to chill your corn down real cold. Now, the reason I say real cold is because I'm not supposed to say freeze your corn, because people break things in their bins by freezing corn. Now, if you freeze corn in a bin and you're going by this, you don't have trouble. But if you freeze corn in a bin and it is 18% or 20% corn, that's when you run into trouble. The damages that come where people are getting buried, I have never seen grain that was in condition cause problems like this. I've seen grain cause problems like this, but not grain that was in condition. It was always grain that was wetter than it should have been, or the fans not run the way they should have been. Plugged sumps, bridged grain, rotten grain, moisture, and aeration. That is what matters. This here, what is the moisture of your corn? Is it the correct moisture to be stored? When you have the correct moisture, are you getting an average where you have 12%, 18%? Because 18% corn does not store till spring. 15 or less does, not 18. So if you have a layer of 18% in here, you got to blow that out. You got to run them fans long enough to blow that equal. So, rule of thumb, when you start filling a grain bin out of a dryer, once there's a foot or more grain in the bin, turn your fans on and let them run until 2 weeks after the bin is full. You get the bin full, you pull a core out of it, and you let the fans run for 2 weeks. We like to save money, and not dry it maybe as good as we should some days, and not aerate it as good as we should some days, and keep the bin plumb full. But how much money do we save keeping the bin plumb full or not aerating if it causes plugged sumps, rotten grain, and bridged grain, and all sorts of issues of the sort? Now, would I ever recommend putting 18% corn or 20% corn in a flat bottom bin? Absolutely. I use flat bottom wet bins all the time. But if you have 20% corn in a bin, you run the fans no matter what. If it's 20% moisture or 25% moisture or 30% moisture, that is fine. But the fans must be sized properly on the bins for wet grain, and the fans must run all the time the grain is in. You cannot shut the fans off, because if you shut the fans off with 25% corn in a bin, that corn will start heating very quickly and you will have rotten grain. So once you put wet grain in a bin, the fans must stay running continuously. And it needs to be dried. It is a wet bin. It's not a place to store wet grain. It is a place to hold wet grain until the dryer is able to dry it. So there are people who store grain 20% in the bin, up to 20% in the bin till spring. But when you start doing that long-term storage of grain that is not in condition, you start running into these issues right here. And these issues are caused by grain out of condition in grain bins. When you see pictures on the internet of big straight walls in bins and stories of people being trapped, there is a really high chance that the grain was not in condition. And it doesn't cost much to run your cooling fans an extra week or so. So thank you for watching. And if you have any other questions, give me a shout.